They thought I wouldn't hear. They thought I wouldn't matter anymore. But standing outside my son-in-law's house that late afternoon, pressed against the siding with my heart pounding like a hammer in my chest, I heard every word. And in that moment I understood. My wife and my son-in-law wanted to paint me as a useless old man, strip me of everything I'd worked for, and call it justice. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. I had only meant to swing by Jason Carter's place because I'd been in the neighborhood. It was one of those ordinary evenings when the sun hung low over the roofs of our quiet Ohio suburb. My old pickup rattled along the street, and then I saw it, Linda's silver Lexus. It was parked right at his curb. That car should have been in our driveway. Seeing it there made the back of my neck prickle. I pulled over a few houses down. My gut told me to leave it alone, but something else, an instinct sharpened by decades in business deals and betrayals, said I needed to know. I walked up the sidewalk, careful, quiet, the way I used to sneak through construction sites to catch lazy foremen off guard. Through Jason's big front window, I saw them. My wife of 25 years, still in her tailored dress and pearls, leaning toward Jason on the couch. He looked tense, his tie loosened, a glass of whiskey sweating in his hand. I strained my ear, and then I heard Linda's voice, calm but cold as stone. When the judge sees him as incompetent, the conservatorship will be ours. It won't matter what Rick wants. He'll have no control. Jason muttered something about debts, about timing. Linda's reply cut me in half. Don't worry. Once the papers are signed, the assets will be divided. He'll be out of the way. He doesn't even have to know until it's too late. I froze, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't just divorce. It wasn't just betrayal. They meant to declare me unfit, powerless, shove me into the corner of my own life. My hands shook as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I hit record. Their voices filled the tiny microphone, every damning word. I pressed my palm against the siding to steady myself. My wife, the woman I'd met when she was a shy secretary in a cramped office downtown, was plotting with our daughter's husband to erase me from my own story. Jason's voice grew sharper. He'll fight this. He's stubborn. You know him. Linda's reply sent a chill straight down my spine. Then we'll make it look like he's losing his memory. We'll call it financial abuse. Everyone already thinks he's controlling. They'll believe me. That was when I realized my knees were trembling. I leaned back, whispering to myself, they want to treat me like I'm nothing, like I'm already gone. I stepped back from the window, every breath jagged. The recording was still running. For a second I imagined barging in, demanding answers. But years in business had taught me something. Never show your hand too soon. I turned and walked back to my truck, each step heavier than the last. The neighborhood looked the same as always, the trimmed hedges, the sound of a lawnmower a few streets away. But for me, everything had shifted. The world I thought I knew had cracked open. On the drive home, memories came flooding. Linda's laugh in our first tiny apartment. The long nights I spent bidding jobs just to keep the company afloat. The pride in her eyes when we moved into the big house. Had it all been theater? Or had something in her hardened, changed, until all she saw in me was a checkbook and a nuisance? By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was almost gone. The porch light flicked on automatically, casting its yellow glow on the steps I'd repaired myself a dozen times over the years. I sat there in the truck, gripping the wheel, until my knuckles turned white. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee from the pot I'd left that morning, sat at the kitchen table, and pressed play on the recording. Linda's voice filled the room. When the judge sees him as incompetent, my hand trembled so hard I almost dropped the phone. I stared at the dark window above the sink, where my reflection looked older than I remembered. The lines around my eyes, the sag in my shoulders. Was this the man they thought they could declare incompetent? I clenched my jaw. I might be over 60, but I wasn't done. I wasn't senile, and I damn sure wasn't going to let anyone, least of all my own wife and son-in-law, decide when my life stopped mattering. I set the phone down, took a long sip of the bitter coffee, and whispered into the silence. You think I'll just lie down and take this? You've forgotten who I am. I didn't sleep that night. The recording kept replaying in my mind, Linda's voice cutting sharper each time, Jason's low growl pushing for more. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it hum and wobble, wondering when my marriage had become an elaborate play staged behind my back. By morning, the house felt foreign. Linda moved around the kitchen like she always did, humming softly as she cracked eggs into a skillet. To anyone else, she looked like the picture of a devoted wife. But now that I knew, I couldn't unsee the cracks in her performance, the way her eyes never lingered on mine, the slight impatience in the set of her jaw. She poured me coffee, smiled faintly, and said, "You've been up early lately, Rick. Everything all right?" I nodded, lifting the cup to my lips, hiding the tremor in my hands. If she noticed, she didn't say. I kept my responses short that morning, and when she left for her club meeting, I stayed seated at the table. I listened to the door click shut, and only then did I exhale. The woman I had trusted for a quarter of a century had mastered the art of pretending. My mind traveled back further and further, until I could almost smell the ink and paper of the office where we first met. Linda had been a secretary back then, answering phones with a bright smile. I was a contractor fighting for my first big deal. She laughed at my nervous jokes, and I thought I'd found someone who believed in me when no one else did. In those days, money was scarce. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment with peeling linoleum and a leaky faucet I never seemed to fix right. But Linda never complained, or so I thought. She wore hand-me-down coats, ate boxed macaroni without protest, and told me she was proud of my long hours. When the business took off, I thought we'd built our success together. I bought her pearls, a new car, a bigger house. I mistook her quiet sighs for gratitude. Looking back, maybe they were something else. Maybe they were seeds of resentment. As the years passed, her circle of friends changed. Suddenly, she had standing lunch dates with women from the country club. She cared about golf tournaments, charity luncheons, and the kind of handbags you had to order months in advance. I used to tease her about the bills, but she'd wave me off saying, "Rick, you can afford it now. Don't be so old-fashioned." Old-fashioned. That word became a wedge between us. Every time she said it, a piece of me shrank. She wanted me sharper, sleeker, more like the polished men at the club who wore Italian suits and never had dirt under their nails. The mask slipped further the night she told me after a fundraiser, "Sometimes you hold me back. You're too cautious, too rooted in the past."
In Nataman Sovri did.
I laughed it off then, but I remembered the sting. Jason entered our lives not long after. He was polished, handsome, quick with a joke. Emily had met him at a legal seminar during graduate school. When she brought him home, Linda was instantly charmed. Jason told stories with just enough detail to sound important, shook my hand with the kind of grip that tried to establish dominance. I didn't trust him from the start. But Linda defended him every time I raised a concern. "He's ambitious, Rick. He'll go places. Don't be so hard on him." Ambitious, yes. But ambition without grounding is a storm, and Jason's storm only grew louder with debt and bad choices. I found out later that he'd already been under scrutiny for sloppy casework, maybe even worse. But back then, all I had was suspicion. And suspicion wasn't enough to protect Emily from the charm he poured over her. She loved him, and love makes us blind. Now, years later, the two of them, Linda and Jason, were united, and not in loyalty to family, but in greed. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with a recording playing in my head, and I tried to piece together how long Linda had been slipping away from me. Maybe it hadn't been sudden at all. Maybe it was a slow drift, masked with smiles and routines, until the mask finally cracked and I saw what lay underneath. The neighbor across the street waved, his dog tugging at the leash. I waved back, forcing a smile. To him, we were still the Millers, the stable couple with the big house, the successful daughter, the polished life. Appearances were easy to believe. But I now knew better. That evening, Linda returned home carrying shopping bags. She chatted about trivial things, new curtains for the den, a dinner invite from one of her friends at the club. Her voice floated through the living room while I sat in my recliner, pretending to read the paper. At one point, she touched my shoulder lightly, like she always had. "Don't stay up too late working, all right?" I nodded, hiding the bitterness rising in me. How many times had that same gentle touch fooled me into thinking we were still on the same side? When she finally went upstairs, I stayed in the recliner, staring at the paper without seeing a word. The mask had slipped, and I could never put it back for her. My phone buzzed on the table. A notification lit up, Jason's name. My chest tightened as I read the preview of a message meant for Linda but somehow copied to our shared family plan. 4 words that hollowed me out. If he won't sign, we'll push harder. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let out a long, shaky breath. They weren't done. They weren't even close. The morning after that message, I drove straight to the bank. My coffee sat untouched in the cup holder as I pulled into the parking lot, a knot tightening in my chest. For years, I had treated those tellers and managers like extended family. They'd watched me deposit the first small checks from my contracting jobs, then later the bigger ones when the company began to thrive. But that day, stepping through the glass doors, I felt like a stranger in my own life. I asked to see Mr. Watkins, the branch manager. He'd known me for 20 years, a solid man with gray hair and suspenders who always called me Mr. Miller, even when I told him to use Rick. He shook my hand warmly. "What brings you in today?" I leaned closer. "I need to review some account activity. Something isn't adding up." We sat in his office, the blinds half drawn. He tapped at the keyboard, scrolling through my business account, then our joint personal account. My stomach sank as the numbers flickered across the screen. Transfers. Several of them. Large sums. Gone. 47,000, Watkins said slowly, adjusting his glasses. These went into a secondary account. "Is that yours?" I shook my head. My throat was dry. "Whose name?" He clicked through the record. "It's joint. Linda Miller and Jason Carter." The room tilted. My palms pressed flat on his desk. "That's impossible. I never authorized." He held up a hand gently. "Mr. Miller, there's a power of attorney document on file. It was used to authorize these transfers." My blood ran cold. "A power of attorney? I never signed one." Watkins opened the digital file, turned the screen toward me. And there it was, my name, my signature scrawled across the bottom of a legal form granting Linda authority over financial matters. Only, it wasn't my handwriting. The loops were too wide, the R uneven. Someone had tried to mimic me, and poorly at that. I stared at it so long my eyes watered. Finally, I whispered, "That's a forgery." Watkins looked uncomfortable. "It was notarized." I slammed my fist softly against the desk. "Not by me. That's not my hand. They're stealing from me." He was to said, in the Abidius Adano. For a long moment he said nothing, just folded his hands. Then he leaned in, voice low. "You need to take this seriously. If someone's trying to declare you incompetent and they already have this document, it can snowball fast. I've seen it before." The word incompetent hit me like a brick. I thanked him, took the printed copy of the document, and walked out into the parking lot with the pages trembling in my hand. Back in the truck, I sat staring at my name, my stolen name. I had signed contracts worth millions, checks that kept crews fed, permits that built schools and homes. My name was my bond, and now it was being used as a weapon against me. That evening, Linda breezed into the house carrying groceries. She kissed my cheek lightly and chattered about a new menu at the country club. I kept the forged document folded in my pocket, the paper burning against my thigh. I wanted to confront her, to slam it down on the table and demand answers, but I bit my tongue. Years on job sites had taught me patience. You don't call out a foreman the first time you see him cut corners. You gather proof, you wait for the right moment, and then you bring it all down. So I smiled faintly, said nothing, and excused myself to the study. There, I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a leather-bound journal I hadn't touched in years. I began to write dates, times, what I'd seen and heard, the recording, the message, the transfers, the forged signature. If they wanted to play this game, I'd build my own record. Later that week, I paid a visit to my lawyer, an old friend named Hal Turner. He'd handled small matters for me in the past: property disputes, contract negotiations. When I showed him the forged power of attorney, his face darkened. Rick, this isn't just shady. This is criminal. If they push this into court, they could argue you're unfit, and with this document, they'd have leverage. I clenched my jaw. They're not going to win. Not with me still breathing. Hal leaned back. You need more evidence. Record everything. Keep track of every transaction. And don't tip your hand until we're ready. That night, alone at the kitchen table, I stared at the journal and felt the weight of it. My wife and my son-in-law were building a case to erase me, but I wasn't powerless. I still had my wits, my experience, and now my proof. The next morning, Emily stopped by unexpectedly. She smiled, but her eyes looked tired. She set a paper coffee cup on the table for me, then sat across from me, fiddling with the sleeve. "Dad," she said softly, "Mom's been saying some things about you not keeping up, about maybe needing help with the company. Is there any truth to that?" I studied her face. My daughter, the one I'd taught to ride a bike, to drive a car, the one whose science projects I stayed up late helping with. She was torn. I could see it in her eyes. "Emily," I said gently, "do I look like a man who can't keep his own accounts?" She hesitated. But Mom sounds so convincing." I reached into my pocket, touched the folded document, but stopped myself. Not yet. Not until I was certain she was ready to see. Instead, I leaned forward. "Don't believe everything you hear. Remember, masks can look real until they fall apart." Her eyes flickered with confusion, then worry. She squeezed my hand, then stood to leave. When the door closed, I sat there alone again, the weight pressing down. My own daughter was being pulled into their orbit. If I didn't act soon, I could lose her too. That night, I unfolded the forged signature once more, staring at the shaky imitation of my name. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from anger. "They think they can rewrite my life," I whispered to the empty kitchen. "But I'm not done writing it myself." It started as whispers. I noticed it first at the grocery store, in the produce aisle where I'd bought the same apples and potatoes for years. Two women from the neighborhood, their carts nearly colliding, stopped talking the instant I passed by. They smiled politely, but their eyes lingered just a little too long, and I knew that look. Pity mixed with suspicion. By the time I reached the checkout, the cashier, a young man who had always greeted me with a cheerful, "How's business, Mr. Miller?" simply nodded. No eye contact, no small talk. Something had shifted. Later that afternoon, a letter slid under my front door. It bore the neat letterhead of our homeowners association. Inside, the words felt clinical, but sharp. Concerns had been raised, it said, about my ability to keep up with property obligations. There were rumors about forgetfulness, about the company being run into the ground. They invited me to attend the next HOA meeting to address the community's worries. Linda was behind it. I could hear her voice in the phrasing measured, sympathetic on the surface, but cutting underneath. That Sunday, I put on my suit and drove to church. It had been my routine for decades. The same wooden pew, the same hymn book with my initials written faintly inside the cover. But as I walked through the double doors, I felt the eyes. People I'd shared potlucks with, whose kids I'd watched grow, now greeted me with tilted heads, soft voices, as if I were fragile. During fellowship hour in the basement, I stood with a paper cup of weak coffee while conversations hummed around me. A woman I'd known for years leaned toward another and whispered, not quietly enough, "Poor Linda, it must be so hard on her." Her companion clucked sympathetically, "Living with a man who's slipping. She's so strong." I felt the words slice through me. Slipping. That was the story Linda was weaving me as a senile old man, losing my grip on the very life I'd built. Reverend Harris approached, kind eyes behind his glasses. "Rick, good to see you here. You know, if you ever feel overwhelmed, the congregation is here to help." Overwhelmed. Another polite dagger. I forced a smile. "I appreciate that, Reverend, but I'm managing just fine." He patted my arm as if humoring me. Then he walked away. On the drive home, the radio played an old country song about loyalty. I couldn't listen. I snapped it off and drove in silence, every turn of the wheel grinding against me. When I pulled into the driveway, Linda's car was already there. She was in the kitchen, arranging flowers into a vase. humming as though she hadn't just poisoned my reputation. I dropped my keys on the counter harder than I meant to. "You've been busy," I said flatly. She looked up, feigning surprise. "What do you mean?" "The rumors, the HOA letter, the church." I stepped closer. "You're painting me as a man losing his mind." Her lips curved, not quite a smile. "People notice things, Rick. You've seemed distracted, forgetful. I can't control what they say." I slammed my hand on the table. "Don't lie to me. This is your doing." Her face stayed calm, but her eyes glittered with something cold. "Maybe if you stepped aside, let younger hands guide the business, no one would worry." I wanted to shout, to rip the forged document from my pocket and throw it in her face. But instead, I stared at her, the woman I had once trusted above all, and saw a stranger. That night I sat in the dark kitchen with a mug of coffee gone cold. The silence pressed heavy. I thought of Emily, how easily she could be swayed by this new narrative of her father's decline. If the community already believed it, what chance did I have? The weight became unbearable. I gripped the mug too hard, porcelain cracking. Hot liquid spilled across the table, dripping to the floor. I didn't even flinch. I just whispered into the emptiness, voice hoarse, "They want to humiliate me." I knew it was only a matter of time before Linda and Jason pulled Emily deeper into their web. What I didn't expect was how quickly they'd move, or how shameless they'd be in using my own daughter as a pawn. It started with a phone call late one evening. Emily's voice was thin, hesitant. "Dad, can I come over? Just for a little while." "Sing Maybit," in Bruve. When she arrived, she looked exhausted. Her shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight too heavy for her frame. I poured her tea and set it on the kitchen table, the same table where I'd taught her long division, where she'd once spread glitter and glue for school projects. Now, she sat across from me as a woman in her 30s, married, burdened, and torn in two. "Mom says you've been controlling," she whispered, staring into her cup. "That you don't let her make decisions, that you keep everything locked down." I felt my jaw tighten. "And Jason?" Her lips pressed together. "He says the same, that maybe it's time for you to step back, for everyone's sake." The words stabbed deep. But looking at my daughter's face, I knew she wasn't accusing me. She was begging for clarity. "Emily," I said gently, "do you remember when you were 12 and you wanted a horse?" She blinked, startled. "Of course I do." "And then claimed, in Mager of Croston. You begged me for months. Your mother said I was being stubborn, that I controlled the money, that I wouldn't let her spoil you. But what I was really doing was running numbers every night, figuring how to afford not just the horse, but lessons, feed, stable care. When I finally said yes, it wasn't because I wanted control, it was because I wanted you safe. I wanted to be sure it would last." Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded slowly, but then she whispered, "Why does Mom make it sound so different? She says you've been like that with everything money, choices, even with her." The room grew heavy with silence. I could feel the echo of Linda's voice poisoning my daughter's heart. I reached across the table, laid my calloused hand over hers. "I may have been strict, Emily. I may have been careful. But don't mistake care for control. And don't let anyone convince you I'm losing myself. I know exactly who I am." The resin vied. Her fingers trembled under mine. She looked down, conflicted. The next evening, Jason came by. He didn't bother knocking politely. He strode into my living room like he owned it. Emily trailed behind him, eyes red from crying. Jason dropped a folder onto my coffee table. His jaw was set tight, his voice slick with arrogance. "We need to talk about the future, Rick." I leaned back in my recliner, arms crossed. "Go ahead." He slid a document across the table. Divorce papers. Not his, not Emily's, mine. Linda's name signed neatly at the bottom. "She's tired," Jason said smoothly. "She deserves freedom. If you sign these now, things will stay civil. If you don't, well, courts have a way of dragging ugly truths into the light." I picked up the papers, skimmed them, and then let them fall back onto the table. Ugly truths? Like forged signatures and stolen funds? His eyes flickered, just for a second, but then hardened. "You're confused. You're making mistakes. Everyone sees it. Linda just wants peace. Emily's voice cracked as she cut in. Jason, stop. This isn't the way. He rounded on her, slapping another paper down a draft of a separation agreement for them. And as for you, Emily, you need to decide where you stand. With your father or with your husband. Her face went pale. She looked at me, then at him, trapped in the middle of a battlefield neither side would abandon. I stood slowly, my hands steady, though my chest burned with fury. Don't you dare force my daughter into your schemes. If you want to fight me, Jason, fight me. Leave her out of it. Jason smirked. She's part of this whether you like it or not. If she sides with you, she loses everything with me. If she sides with me, she gets to keep her marriage and a future. Emily whispered, almost to herself, a future built on lies? For a moment, Jason's mask cracked. His jaw clenched, his hand curled into a fist at his side. Then he forced a laugh. Think it over, sweetheart. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. He gathered his folder, snapped it shut, and headed for the door. As he passed me, he muttered low enough only I could hear. You're finished, old man. When the door slammed, Emily collapsed onto the couch, tears spilling freely. I sat beside her, pulling her into my arms like I had when she was a child. I don't know what to do, she sobbed. I love him, but I can't stand what he's become. And Mom, she twists everything until I can't tell what's true anymore. I held her tighter. Then listen to what you know, Emily. Listen to your own heart, not theirs. She cried until her breathing steadied. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were swollen but resolute. Dad, she whispered, whatever happens, I don't want to lose you. I kissed the top of her head, my voice low but firm. You won't, not unless you choose to walk away. And I'll never stop fighting to make sure you see the truth. That night after she left, I sat alone again in the silence of my house. Jason's words echoed, venomous. Choose. As if life were that simple, as if loyalty could be split like property. I poured myself another cup of bitter coffee, stared at the cracks in the table from years of use, and whispered, they think they can corner me, but they've forgotten I don't fold under pressure. I never have. Thank you for watching. The Frienders and watching Blyes. And reportant. For weeks I had been playing defense, listening, recording, keeping notes, bracing myself, while Linda and Jason painted me as a man slipping into confusion. But the night Jason threw those papers onto my table and told my daughter to choose between us, something hardened inside me. I had spent a lifetime fighting uphill battles in business, against competitors who wanted to bury me, against banks that didn't believe in me, against storms that nearly wiped me out, and I hadn't lost then. I wasn't about to lose now. The next morning, I made a call to an old acquaintance, a man named Frank Dillard. Frank had retired from the police force years ago and now worked as a private investigator. We'd met back when he was still a detective and I was fighting a zoning dispute on one of my projects. I remembered his handshake firm, honest, and the way he told me once, everybody leaves a trail, Rick, even the slick ones. When Frank picked up, his voice was gravelly but steady. Well. Haven't heard from you in a long time. What can I do for you? I need eyes, I told him. On Jason Carter and on Linda. Discretion is everything. There was a pause. Then, you sound like a man who already knows what he'll find. I need proof, I said. Not suspicions. Proof I can take into a courtroom or put on the table when the lies start flying. Frank didn't ask for more. He just said, meet me tomorrow at the diner, usual corner booth. This was in Armin, into Die Velite. The following day, I sat across from him in the greasy spoon I'd been going to for decades. The waitress filled our cups without asking. She still called me Hun, the way she had since she was 20. Frank wore a worn leather jacket, notebook in his pocket. I laid out everything, the recording, the forged power of attorney, the transfers, the rumors Linda had seeded. Frank scribbled notes, his brow furrowed. You've got the makings of a hell of a case, he said finally. But people like Jason, they get sloppy when they're desperate. That's when the good evidence shows up. 2 weeks later, Frank called me with his first findings. I still remember the tremor in his voice. Rick, your son-in-law is in deeper than you thought. He's not just in debt. He's been shifting client funds around to cover his personal expenses. I've got records, witnesses who'll talk. And there's more. My pulse quickened. More? Frank hesitated. He's not exactly the faithful husband. I've got photos, hotel receipts, nights out with a brunette, not Emily. I felt a rush of anger so strong my hand tightened around the phone. Not only was Jason trying to ruin me, he was tearing my daughter's life apart behind her back. Send me everything, I said. Every scrap. When the envelope arrived, I spread the contents across my desk. Bank statements, emails. Grainy but clear enough photographs. Jason with his arm around a woman outside a hotel. Jason laughing in a bar. Jason handing over cash in a parking lot to a man Frank identified as a loan shark. I sat there for a long time, studying each page. This was ammunition, not gossip, not suspicion, hard proof. That evening, Linda breezed into the kitchen with a new scarf looped around her neck, humming like always. I watched her, the lies she wrapped herself in as easily as silk. For the first time in weeks, I almost smiled. She thought she held all the cards. She thought she had the power to strip me of dignity, of credibility, but she didn't know that I had begun to strike back. The next Sunday at church, I felt the whispers again, but this time, I held my head higher. When someone muttered about poor Linda's struggles, I caught their eye and said calmly, "Sometimes the stories we hear aren't the whole truth. Sometimes they're just performances." C1. I saw a flicker of doubt cross a face or two. That was enough to remind me the narrative wasn't fixed. It could be broken. Days later, Frank and I met again at the diner. He slid another folder across the table. This is everything tied up in a bow. Financial mismanagement, personal indiscretions. The man's a house of cards. I flipped through the evidence. Then I closed the folder and looked at Frank squarely. You've done your part. Now it's my turn. Is aesthetic complaint. Back at home, I locked the folder in my desk. I wasn't ready to unleash it. Not yet. Timing mattered. Let Jason and Linda believe they were still in control. Let them push harder, get bolder, so that when the moment came, their entire foundation would crumble in one blow. That night, as I sat alone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for weeks. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was preparing. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, leaned back in my chair, and whispered into the quiet, almost with a hint of satisfaction. They have no idea who they're dealing with. I've weathered bigger storms than this. Linda always did love a show. When she sent out invitations for her little gathering, a wine and cheese affair at our home, meant to impress the ladies from her club and a few of Jason's colleagues, I knew exactly what she was planning. It wasn't about friendship. It was about reputation. And she was setting the stage to paint me as the doddering husband who'd lost his grip. I sat in my truck down the block, watching the driveway fill with shiny cars. Lexuses, BMWs, a Mercedes. Laughter carried through the cool evening air as guests swept up the walkway. Through the window, I could see Linda in a shimmering dress, pearls at her neck, her arm brushing Jason's as they greeted people. They looked polished, put together, the perfect picture. For a moment, bitterness almost kept me frozen in that truck. But then I remembered the forged signature, the rumors, the way Jason had forced Emily to choose between us, number. I wouldn't stay silent while they smeared me in my own house. I straightened my jacket, grabbed the envelope from the passenger seat, and walked up the driveway. The room quieted when I entered. Some smiles faltered, others stiffened into polite masks. Linda turned, her face flashing surprise, quickly replaced by a too bright smile. "Rick," she said sweetly, "what a surprise. Everyone, my husband decided to join us after all." I scanned the room. Glasses clinked, low whispers buzzed. Jason stood near the bar, smirking like he'd already won. Linda raised her glass. "I was just telling our friends how difficult it's been, keeping everything together while Rick has slowed down. It's been hard, but we carry on, don't we?" The words hung in the air. Sympathetic nods circled the room. I could almost hear the nails hammering into the coffin of my reputation. That's when I stepped forward, pulled the papers from the envelope, and held them high enough for all to see. "Slowed down? My voice cut through the chatter. Is that what she told you? That I've lost my way? Then maybe you'll be interested in this. He's in that to good nine. Please the red and bore. I spread the forged power of attorney on the dining table, the ink stark under the chandelier light. This, I said, is a document giving Linda and Jason control over my finances. A document with my name, my signature, except it's a forgery. The room gasped. A few guests leaned closer, eyes widening at the obvious slant of the handwriting. Linda's smile froze, then cracked. Rick, really? This is embarrassing. You must be confused. That's a legal document, notarized and everything. People will think you've lost your senses, waving it around like this. Jason chimed in smoothly. It's sad, isn't it? Watching a man unravel? We've been so concerned for him. That's why Linda's had to step in. I slammed my palm against the table, making the glasses rattle. Unravel? I built everything you see around me with my own hands. And now you stand here in my house, calling me incompetent, while you forge my name and drain my accounts? A murmur rippled through the crowd. One man, a neighbor from 2 doors down, frowned. Forgery? Is that true? Linda's voice dripped with false pity. You see what I mean. He's imagining things. It breaks my heart. I looked around the room. Some faces softened toward Linda. Others glanced between us, uncertain. Doubt had entered the room, but it hadn't yet chosen its target. I gathered the papers, tucked them back into the envelope. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with resolve. They want you to believe I'm a shadow of myself, I said steadily. But remember this. Truth doesn't vanish just because someone talks louder, and the truth always leaves a trail. For a long moment, silence held the room. Then the conversations rose again, sharper this time, divided. I could hear words forgery, confused, proof swirling around me. I walked to the door, my back straight, my hand tight around the envelope. Linda called after me, her voice sharp under the sugar. Rick, please, you're embarrassing yourself. I didn't turn. I stepped out into the cool night, the murmur of the crowd spilling behind me like a wave. On the porch, under the glow of the lantern, I let the anger drain just enough to breathe. Inside, Linda would spin the moment. Jason would smooth it over. But seeds had been planted. I saw it. In their eyes, doubt. As I walked to my truck, the night air crisp against my face, I whispered to myself, they want the world to think I'm slipping. But the cracks are starting to show. And soon, everyone will see. It was close to midnight when I heard the knock on my door. At first, I thought it might be the wind rattling the frame, but then came another, softer tap. I opened the door to find Emily standing there, her eyes red, her coat pulled tight against the chill. Dad, she whispered, can I come in? I stepped aside. She walked in quickly, as if afraid someone might see her. Her hands trembled as she set her purse on the counter. What's wrong? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it on the kitchen table with shaky fingers. I found this, she said, in Mom's desk drawer. I leaned down, scanning the document. A transfer slip. Thousands of dollars wired from one of our accounts to Jason's Everysea. Dates, amounts, signatures, clear as day. Emily's voice broke. I confronted her. She said it was for bills, for household things. But Dad, I'm not stupid. I can read numbers. I've seen how Jason spends. This money wasn't for groceries. It wasn't for me. It was for him. Her tears spilled freely now, dripping onto the paper. Emily, I said gently, I'm sorry you had to see it this way. I wanted to protect you from the worst of it. She shook her head violently. I should have seen it sooner. I kept defending them, Mom. Jason, because I didn't want to believe they could betray you. But now it's in front of me. I can't deny it anymore. I pulled out a chair, sat beside her. She buried her face in her hands. For a moment, the only sound was the old clock ticking on the wall. When she lifted her head, her eyes glistened in the dim kitchen light. Dad, I believe you. I believe everything you've said, and I'm so sorry I doubted. My throat tightened. You don't have to apologize. You've been caught between people you love. That's no easy place to stand.
And where he was a quarter.
But I can't stand there anymore, she whispered fiercely. Not when the truth is right here. I want to be on your side this time. Let me fight with you. Her hand found mine across the table, small, trembling, but firm. I covered it with both of mine, calloused from decades of work, and held on. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something break through the fog of betrayal. Hope. We'll need to be ready, I said quietly. Court's coming. They'll throw everything at us, lies, crocodile tears, accusations, but we've got more than words. We've got proof. And now, we've got each other. Emily nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve.
I'll testify if I have to. I'll tell the judge what I saw, what Mom said, what Jason did. No more hiding.
The house felt different then. For so long it had been hollow, echoing with silence and mistrust. But now, sitting in the yellow glow of the old kitchen lamp, it felt alive again. A father and daughter, bound not by the illusions others spun, but by truth. I thought back to when Emily was small, when she'd cling to my hand crossing the street, trusting me to lead her safely. Now the roles had shifted. She was the one reaching for me, choosing trust, choosing truth. I squeezed her hand. Emily, you don't know how much this means. After everything, you standing with me, it gives me strength. She managed a shaky smile. We're Millers, Dad. We don't back down, right? I laughed softly, the sound rusty in my chest. That's right. We don't back down. We sat there a long while, talking in low voices, making plans. About lawyers, about what documents to gather, about witnesses who might step forward. Frank's evidence, the forged POA, the transfer slips piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. At one point, Emily reached over and turned off the overhead light, leaving only the small lamp on the counter glowing. It feels safer this way, she said. Like no one can see us. The dim light cast shadows across the room, but it also made the space feel warmer, closer. She leaned her head on my shoulder, just as she had as a child when she'd fallen asleep on long car rides. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could win this fight. When Emily finally stood to leave, the night outside was still and cold. She hugged me tightly at the door, whispering into my chest, I'm with you now, Dad, all the way. I held her as if I could shield her from everything. Then I let her go, watching her walk to her car, the taillights glowing red as she pulled away. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the transfer slip she'd brought me. The paper was creased, smudged with her tears, but to me, it gleamed like gold. It was proof, yes, but it was also the symbol of her choice. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't alone. I turned off the lamp, the house sinking into quiet darkness, and whispered into the night, We're ready. Let them come. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of place where lives are reshaped by signatures and verdicts. As I walked through the heavy doors, Emily at my side, I felt the weight of everything pressing down the lies, the rumors, the betrayals, but also the strength of the truth we carried. Linda and Jason were already seated at their table, flanked by lawyers in tailored suits. Linda wore black, a tissue clutched in her hand, her posture fragile as though she might crumble at any moment. Jason sat upright, jaw tight, eyes gleaming with the smugness of a man who believed he had played every card right. I took my seat across from them, Emily squeezing my hand under the table. My lawyer, Hal Turner, leaned in. Remember, Rick, stay steady. Don't rise to their bait. We'll let the evidence speak. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and the proceedings began. Linda's attorney stood first, painting a picture of a suffering wife trapped under the thumb of a controlling husband. Mrs. Miller, he asked, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy, can you tell the court what it has been like to live under Richard Miller's control? Linda dabbed her eyes with the tissue, her voice trembling. For years, I've been silenced. Every purchase questioned, every choice second-guessed. He kept the accounts locked, treated me like a child. I had no freedom, no dignity. The murmurs in the courtroom tightened around me like a noose. I felt my chest burn, but I forced myself to stay still. And has his mental state declined? The lawyer pressed. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. He forgets things, important things. He rants. He accuses me of terrible things I never did. It's frightening. I had to seek help. That's why I turned to my son-in-law for support. Jason leaned forward, his expression solemn, his voice smooth. Your Honor, it wasn't just emotional control. Mr. Miller has become a danger to his own estate. That's why the power of attorney was enacted to protect the family. Without it, everything he worked for could vanish in reckless decisions. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms. Lies layered on lies, and the courtroom seemed to drink them in. Finally, Hal rose. His voice was calm, deliberate. Your Honor, we intend to show that what you've just heard is a carefully crafted illusion, and we have evidence, hard, undeniable evidence that will shatter it. He called me to the stand. My knees stiffened as I rose, but Emily's encouraging glance steadied me. I swore my oath and sat, the wood of the witness chair pressing into my back. Hal began gently. Mr. Miller, have you ever willingly signed a power of attorney giving Linda Miller and Jason Carter control over your finances? No, I said firmly. Never. Then how do you explain this document? He held up the forged POA. I leaned forward, pointing at the signature. That isn't my handwriting. Anyone who knows me can see it. The loops, the slant, it's an imitation. A poor one. A ripple went through the courtroom. Hal continued. And what about these transactions? He placed bank records on the screen.
$47,000 transferred from Mr. and Mrs. Miller's account into a joint account with Jason Carter, without Mr. Miller's consent.
I watched Linda's face blanch, Jason's jaw twitch. And there's more, Hal said, his voice rising. He gestured to the back of the courtroom. Frank Dillard stepped forward, sworn in, and testified to his surveillance. Jason meeting loan sharks, Jason with another woman outside a hotel, Jason funneling client money into personal accounts. Gasps filled the room. Even the judge's brows lifted. Jason's lawyer tried to object, but Hal pressed on. Then came the recording, the very words I had captured that night outside Jason's house. Linda's voice, Jason's voice, plotting to strip me of everything, mocking the old fool who would sign away his life. The courtroom fell silent as the audio played, each word a dagger turning back on them. Linda buried her face in her hands. Jason stared straight ahead, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the table. When the recording ended, Hal turned to the judge. Your Honor, this isn't the portrait of a confused old man. This is the portrait of a man betrayed by those closest to him. A husband and father who has been targeted, manipulated, and defrauded. The judge leaned forward, voice grave. I've heard enough. The gavel struck once. The divorce petition is denied. The court finds grounds to investigate perjury, fraud, and financial misconduct. This matter will be referred to the district attorney's office. The words echoed through the chamber like thunder. Linda's lawyer sank into his seat. Jason muttered a curse under his breath. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders trembling with the release of months of tension. Emily clasped my hand, her eyes brimming with relief and pride. As we stood to leave, the judge's gavel still reverberating in my ears, I thought, justice has only begun. Their empire of lies is collapsing. The weeks that followed the trial felt like stepping out of a storm. For months, I had been bracing against the wind, head down, battered by lies. Now, for the first time, the air was still. But it wasn't peace just yet. The dust was still settling, and the consequences had only begun to unfold. Jason's downfall came swiftly. The state bar wasted no time once the evidence of his financial misconduct hit their desks. The photos, the bank records, the testimony from Frank, all of it was more than enough. Within days, Jason Carter's license to practice law was suspended. Within weeks, it was gone, for good. I read the official notice in the newspaper over my morning coffee. There was no joy in it, not exactly. But there was a satisfaction, a sense that the balance had tilted back toward truth. Jason, the man who had strutted into my living room with false papers and smug threats, was now reduced to nothing more than a headline of disgrace, I heard later that he tried to apply for jobs in other states, but no firm would touch him. Eventually, he left town altogether. Someone said they saw him working as an assistant in a legal office in another city, stripped of any authority. For a man who once thrived on power and appearances, that was a punishment sharper than any jail cell. Linda's fall was different, slower, and in some ways more brutal. The woman who had once floated through boutiques and country clubs with a glass of Chardonnay in hand was suddenly shunned. Friends from the ladies' club stopped calling. The churchwomen who once whispered, "Poor Linda," now crossed the street to avoid her. The final blow came when she had to sell her jewelry, the pearls she had worn the night of that cursed party, just to make rent. She took a job at a department store in the mall, folding sweaters under the same fluorescent lights where she used to spend my money so freely. I saw her once, by accident. I was passing through to buy a gift for a neighbor's retirement. There she was, behind the counter, her face carefully painted but her eyes hollow. For a moment, our gazes met. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but I turned away. Some words are too late to matter. As for Emily, she walked a harder road, but one that led to freedom. She filed for divorce, signed the papers with a steady hand, and walked out of that toxic marriage with nothing but her dignity and her determination. She rented a small office downtown and hung a sign with her name, Emily Miller, licensed therapist. The first day she opened her doors, I brought her flowers. She hugged me so tightly, I could feel her ribs. "Dad," she said through tears, "I wouldn't be here without you." I told her the truth. "You're here because you found your own strength. I just reminded you it was there." The community, too, shifted. At first, there had been whispers and pity, eyes cast down when they looked at me. But after the trial, after the evidence, something changed. Neighbors stopped me on the street to shake my hand. Men at the diner offered to buy my coffee. Even Reverend Harris, who had once patted my arm with pity, sought me out after service one Sunday. "Rick," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I believed the wrong story." I nodded, not unkindly. "We all did, Reverend. That's what makes lies so dangerous they sound like truth, until the proof comes out. And it is round." I didn't need his apology, but it mattered that he offered it. Bit by bit, my reputation returned, not as a man who had fallen apart, but as one who had stood firm. One evening, after dinner, I carried my chair out onto the porch. The sun was setting slow and wide, painting the sky with strokes of orange and pink. The old boards creaked under my weight, familiar, steady. I thought about everything that had been lost the years I had given Linda, the trust shattered beyond repair, the loneliness of knowing that love had been nothing but a costume. But I also thought about what remained. Emily, stronger now than ever. My company, still standing. My own name, cleared. I wasn't bitter anymore. Tired, yes. Older, certainly. But not bitter. As the last light slipped over the horizon, I whispered into the quiet, "Turns out the most valuable thing isn't the money or the house or the business. It's the right to lift your head when you're old. The right to know you didn't let them take your dignity." The crickets began their song. The air cooled against my skin. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. From this story, we can draw many profound lessons about family, justice, and dignity. First, trust is the foundation of every relationship, but once it is betrayed, the damage is not only material loss, but also emotional scars that are hard to heal. The story also reminds us that greed and deceit, no matter how carefully disguised, will eventually be exposed under the light of truth. For the elderly, dignity and the right to be respected matter more than wealth. Justice may come late, but it will come if we remain steadfast in protecting the truth. At the same time, Emily's choice shows the strength of standing on the side of what is right, even if it means going against those you love. In the end, the greatest value in life is not possessions, but the right to live with honor and hold your head high in the later years of life. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.